Um, so, as always, so good to be with you this morning, and I wanted to continue this sequence of talks and meditations on uh, this sequence called "The Stages of the Path," or Lamrim, and the the stages of the path meditations divide all of these meditations into three parts. Into all of these various meditations, all the main meditations that we need to do, divide into three categories: what's called the initial scope, the intermediate scope, and the great scope. And these three are distinguished in terms of how we think about ourself and others, and how we think about this fundamental problem of solving our problems. That all of our mental energy is always directed towards this question about how do we solve our problems. Is that an overstatement? I don't think it is particularly, even if you're just kind of looking around aimlessly, right? You're trying to solve your boredom problem, for example. We're always trying to get information about what's going on around us. Can you guys all hear us? Hear me okay? Good. So when we think about this challenge about how do we solve our problems, there's implicit in this, there's some subtleties implicit in this. Normally, well, okay, that's not always a subtle challenge. How do we solve our problems? I'm getting a little hungry. How do I solve my hunger problem? I've got food downstairs. I'll go and eat some food. And it's a pretty straightforward way to solve that problem. But we encounter more difficult problems that really trouble us, problems about why is our life unfair in certain aspects, or why do we feel lonely or in pain, or why are people unkind to us or to others, or those we love. And we face bigger problems in terms of why is there so much suffering, misery in the world, right? Like, why is there so much conflict, war, fighting in the world? Why do people make such seemingly terrible decisions about how we should invest our energy as a civilization or as individuals? My wife recently introduced me to a series of YouTube videos from a guy basically interviewing mostly homeless addicts and prostitutes and people with mental illness and people living in really backwoods parts of Appalachia, often also struggling with addiction. It's been very interesting hearing they'd spend like 30 minutes recounting their problems, recounting their challenges. And one of the conclusions that my wife and I came from looking at these stories is that some of these people are homeless because it's a bit easier to manage the logistics of being homeless. It's in fact quite freeing to not have bills to pay and places to show up, and they have often very mixed and contradictory feelings about their drug addictions, for example. On one hand, regretting getting into drug addiction. On the other hand, enjoying the drug and not wanting to leave that lifestyle. And so you sort of get these cycles where people remain sort of stuck in a situation that is for them this contradictory balance of like dangerous, risky, dissatisfying, full of regrets, but as well also a bit simpler. Many of them talk about having met wonderful people in that life and enjoying the freedom, and it's this strange contradiction. And of course, it's very personal. And it's hard to generalize, but it's interesting for me because I don't hear those stories. I'm not familiar with those stories by and large. And it's one thing that it tells, though, is that it's harder to get by in modern civilizations, more complex. I just did my taxes last week, and I do the taxes for my wife and I keep telling her, if I die, just pay someone to do the taxes. It's not worth it. I don't know how most people do their taxes. It's just like, it feels like that could easily drive someone to want to quit their jobs and just live on the street to avoid the struggle and the suffering of ever having to do your taxes again. Because it's bizarrely complicated, in America at least. So there is this struggle and suffering that we experience, though, trying to make it through our normal life. And it takes a lot to hold together a normal life, to hold a job, to hold friends. And one of the reasons these people often found it a lot easier to be homeless and so is that there's this constant struggle in our work to, for example, not get fired. Like, you say one thing wrong and you could get fired at any time, or to not lose friendships. There's a careful balancing act that we're all doing socially, to act in a presentable way, to groom ourselves socially, to impress other people enough to want to spend more time with us, to, I'm struggling now to say something interesting enough for you to feel that your time here is justifiable. At any moment I could go off the rails. And there's always this sort of underlying tension about trying to keep it all together. Life is harder than it seems like it should be. And I definitely feel that around tax time. This is harder than it should be. Like, what is this? And so the initial section of the initial section of the Lamrim, the stages of the path, are all about a fairly simple way of thinking about solving our problems by guiding our behavior, focused on act in kind ways, act the way that you would want to be treated. It's a strong version of the golden rule, this law of karma, that basically we can't really separate ourselves from others. You hurt others, you're hurting yourself. It's like, and that's a powerful kind of teaching to internalize deeply in your heart. The power of treating others definitely the way that we want to be treated, and knowing that we can never really escape the consequences of harmful actions. It's it's the most important ethic we need to build on. The second stage of these stages of the path is really deeply considering who we are, and the deepest of all of these fears, this sort of like the little whispers at the edge, the little whispering worries at the edge of our mind, worrying about death and loneliness and falling into obscurity, and what was the purpose of our life, and these kinds of deeper worries. This middle stage, the intermediate scope of Lamrim, tackles this head on, and this is in fact the heart of Buddhism, is this sort of understanding of solving our problems through reinterpreting who we are. And then the great scope of the Lamrim moves on to focus on solving others' problems and really thinking about others, building a big heart and a good heart. So what do I mean by solving our own problems by reinterpreting who we are? We assume we know who we are. Like, I ask you, who are you? You give me your name, and maybe you give me your occupation, so you're identified with a name. Now, your parents gave you that name sometime some decades back, right? Is that who you are really? It's just an identifier. It's not who you are really. You tell me your occupation, you can say where you lived, but of course, many people do that occupation. Many people live in that area. You can say who you're married to and who your family is. And you're basically trying to identify these different characteristics. And one of the things we say is when we were born, and then on Wikipedia, if you look up a person, it'll say the birth date, and then they'll have a dash, and then they'll have a blank spot. if they're not yet dead, or they'll have a number if they are dead. And this idea that we're bookended between these two phenomena of birth and death. But in between, we feel very clearly and strongly like we're existing, like we're here. I'm here. I definitely exist. Now, that death bit, that blank spot on the Wikipedia entry, that's the bit that worries us. Definitely working hard to avoid that blank spot. And we're avoiding that number being filled in before we feel we've had a chance to fulfill our life's purpose. And so our situation is quite precarious. And there's this underlying fear of death. I mentioned in the Tuesday class, little known fact, Buddha's mom died in childbirth and he was raised by his aunt. And from early on, even though he had a very comfortable, fortunate life, he was very concerned about this challenge of death. And it's like always hanging over us, right? Imagine the person closest to you, you never knew her, and this threat of death taking the person who's closest to you away, right? So we all live under that sword, hanging above our heads. We don't always think about it. We certainly don't always tackle that challenge head on, that question. But he was really interested in this question of, why do we die? And what does it mean? And how do you avoid that? If that's this deep underlying nagging fear, what are you going to do about that fear, right? There's a lot of fears you can address. Fear of poverty, you try to accumulate money. None of these things are really stable. Money is not really stable. Nowadays, you sort of think, I've accumulated all this money. Oh, sure hope the global economy doesn't completely tank and we go into thermonuclear warfare and then everything's, gone, right? It's all much more precarious than we realize. It's all a dependent relationship. Supply chains, economy, and political international relations, and our personal health, and any of these things could go wrong. It's this strange sort of unstable balance. It is described in the traditional teachings, it's described as trying to prevent ourselves from drowning. So if you're in the water, you're floating in the water, right? I can tread water. We can all tread water for a while, right? But there's always this risk, right? This risk of drowning. And there's an anxiety in that experience of drowning, and we're experiencing a low level of that anxiety all the time. And that's kind of Buddha's thesis. There's this low level anxiety, as if we're almost on the edge of drowning. And there's this society-wide anxiety now that gets this emotional contagion that goes over social media. Right now, we're all connected to these worries. You're hoping I'll get to the good part soon. It's like, what's all this bad news ruining my Saturday morning? So Buddha went into the forest to try to ponder this challenge. Why on earth would anybody go into the forest? What he was doing, he was separating himself from society, because we are social creatures, and even the way we think, even the way we feel, is like a microcosm of society and how we're socially conditioned. It's like scooping up a ladleful of humanity. That's kind of what we are. We're just a ladleful from the ocean of humanity, the fears, the biases, the prejudices, and so forth. By going into the forest, he separated himself from society so he could think deeply, very, very deeply. And then gradually, when he gained his realizations, he built a community, and they also lived in the forest, separate from society, so they could listen very deeply, think very deeply, meditate, contemplate. And so Buddhism was something that was developed in incubation, sort of in an incubator in the forest. Basically, these were homeless people, but not drug addicts, but they were homeless meditators. And this incubation happened because it's the truths that he was dealing with are quite subtle, right? A little bit like the reason you incubate something is when it's a little bit fragile. biological experiment. You need to incubate in a clean room to avoid contamination. Like building a microchip, Intel building a microchip, they create these clean rooms and no specks of dust can be in there because it's very sensitive. So these subtle truths here are truths that were discovered in isolation, in contemplation, in solitude. And so for us to understand them is a little bit subtle, and we need to think a bit carefully. And that's really the purpose of meditation, as I've said before, is like stabilizing the candle flame of our mind. If we think of our mind as like having the capacity for illuminating things, we can think about something and we can understand it. So it's like a candle flame that illuminates. But if the candle flame is being blown by the wind, it's flickering, is harder to see. It doesn't shine a steady, constant illumination. So the purpose of meditation is to still the mind a bit so we can think more deeply, and the candle flame of our mind can shine a steady, focused illumination on the topic that we're contemplating. And so what was Buddha's conclusion when he contemplated this question of how do we solve death problem? It's an unsolvable problem, like a Gordian knot. How do you solve this death problem? He said, okay, why do I die? I die because I was born. Why is that end pit on Wikipedia going to get, that number going to get filled in? It's because there's the first number. I was born in 1976. Somebody will fill in a final number there. But the two are definitely related. You can't die if you weren't born. So why do I think I was born? When I say that, I was born. That's a funny statement, isn't it? I was born. Who was born? Like, it's like as if birth was something that happened to me. I was born. Well, what was I before I was born? Funny statement, right? And this language reflects how we think. Language is a reflection of how we think, and it's a reflection of how we think socially, right? Our language reflects how we think collectively, socially, together. And thinking in a different way is actually an act of rebellion, because you're not only thinking differently, you're breaking away from the socially entrained ways of thinking. So I was born. It's implying that there is some sense of I, like that I have some sense of I. Well, there must be some I if I was born, right? Like Descartes spent a long time thinking. He came to the conclusion, I think, therefore I am. So he's like, I must exist because I'm thinking. But even in that I'm thinking, well, clearly it's, there's some implicit belief that there's an I that exists, right? And that can perform some action, and therefore that I must, that I exist. If it can perform an action, the I must exist. So there's this close relationship between acting and being. So I think and I speak and I, do all these things, therefore I must be. This deep belief that I exist. And so the death problem, Buddha's conclusion, the death problem comes from the birth problem. The birth problem comes from this sense that we exist. Now, what does that mean to exist? It means that normally we have a sense something comes into existence, it exists for a period of time, and then it goes out of existence. That is a completely terrible and inaccurate way of describing how we exist, right? So you take the analogy of a candle flame. You light the candle flame. It comes into existence. It exists for a period of time. It goes out. The candle burns out, goes out. Did the candle flame just exist during that time? We say, oh, it existed, but the candle flame is a process. It's a constant burning. It's it's not a thing, really. You can flick your finger through a candle flame. There's nothing there, right? There's no substance to it. It's an appearance like light, but there's no substance to it. So right now we are metabolizing energy. We're burning through energy. It's generating mental energy. You're listening. You're trying to figure out what's the point he's trying to make. I've been here for 27 minutes. There's this brain metabolizing. You're thinking, you're pondering. That is a process, right? Our existence, our life is like a process, like a candle flame burning, right? But that is not how we think of ourselves, right? We have a very strong concept. I exist. I'm doing that. I'm doing this. It is like a cartoon character, right? This version of ourselves that we think about. It's a caricature of reality. It's a story that we tell ourselves. And in that story that we tell ourselves of our life, all kinds of dramatic, terrible things happen. People do bad things to us, and we do bad things to others. There's a story, I. Endless story, right? Conceptual, conscious story of who we are, who we think we are. None of that matches, none of that's even remotely a good description of what's actually happening in our body, in our mind, this constant flow of, like a candle flame burning, this constant metabolism of energy that generates mind, that is perceiving a world, but that world is not even separate from our mind. So beneath all of this, right, is this, there's a lot more. There's even some further steps that Buddha contemplated beneath, sort of driving. What is it that drives me to tell this story, to think that I exist, right? What is it that drives me to believe I am? It's such a final statement, such an absolute statement. I was born. I am. I'm here. It's such a caricature of reality. It's such a mismatch. To an accurate description of what's actually going on with the body and mind. What drives that? This anyway. There's a craving for stability. There's a craving for certainty. There's a craving for constancy. There's a craving to know what's going on. That's driving underneath all of this. So this is the real purpose of, well, this is getting to the real purpose of meditation from Buddhist point of view. Originally, it's introduced to the West as like a way to reduce your anxiety a little bit. That's nice, like yoga class. But there's something much deeper, right? The deepest anxiety of like the deepest anxieties that underlie our psychology, that make us, that underlie all of our other fears and problems. They're rooted in how we think about ourselves. And so in our meditation, as usual, we can do a very simple meditation. And the simple meditation is just becoming aware of our body. But why do we do this meditation? To show us the difference between who we think we are and what's actually happening in the body, because they're shockingly different. And maybe we think it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I breathe and what's going on in my body, what's actually going on in my mind. Well, it kind of matters if the story that you're living in is such a worrisome story, such a vulnerable story. Why don't we take a look at what's actually happening, for example, in the body? Why don't we take a look at what's actually happening in our feeling? Why don't we take a look at what's actually happening in our mind? And by looking at what's actually happening, the worries based on the story or the caricature of who we are can go away, and we can develop a much deeper understanding. So we should understand that things like meditation on the breath, meditation on the body, they're part of this bigger picture. This part of this bigger picture of looking at this candle flame of our existence and recalibrating our sense of self to be a realistic recognition that the self is just a name that we give, just like the name our parents gave. So to the word I is just a name, it's just a label. It's not the truth. So again, as usual, we will meditate mostly on our body and our breathing, but we do that with this better knowledge, this better understanding of the purpose of this meditation. So I'll be mostly quiet in the beginning, saying a few words to guide us to our breath, and then later saying a few words to guide us to our friends and family and society. So we find first a comfortable position. The main point with our posture is we can use it to keep ourselves more awake and alert if we start feeling sleepy. If you start feeling sleepy, sit more upright. We take a deep breath in and out. And another breath, just inviting our body to relax. And then another breath, just asking ourselves what is important right now. And then we sit with our body, recognizing it is like a candle flame, a constant process. then we can notice gently, even when we're meditating, we tend to think, I am meditating. The sense of I is always in the back of our mind. But is that an accurate description of what's happening? And we bring to mind our social circle, our friends, family, those we spend time with. When we imagine them, we are holding in our mind a caricature of what they are, who they are. It is just imagination. They too are like a candle flames, process and unfolding. We can conclude by recognizing that we have deepened these channels of wisdom and peace in our mind. And the more we tread these mental pathways, the deeper they become, and the more readily we can help others to follow the same pathways. Then before we leave our meditation, we make a decision, a determination to enjoy time that is quiet and meditative, to enjoy watching this inner process of the mind, knowing that it is a gateway to both peace and wisdom for ourselves and others. can open our eyes and rise from meditation.